Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just want to thank all the DFP folks who came, some of the foundation folks who are here tonight. Thank you very much. I think you'll enjoy our speaker. One quick note, our next speaker will be June 13th. This year is the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act, which ties directly into the Mexican wolf, actually. So on June 13th at 7 o'clock, we're going to have a speaker talking about the Endangered Species Act, the first 50 years, with the perfectly named Lowell Bear. So he will be here on June 13th at 7 o'clock. Please consider coming back for that. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Tonight you're going to hear from Maggie Dwire. She's the Deputy Mexican Wolf Recovery Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She has degrees in biological anthropology and environmental studies, and Maggie started her career with the service more than 20 years ago, already focused on Mexican wolves. Her responsibilities as Deputy Recovery Coordinator include recovery and management of the Mexican wolf, both in the wild and she's also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's liaison to the binational captive breeding program. She gives a scintillating presentation. I think you'll enjoy it. It's perfectly appropriate for the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act this year. So please give a very warm welcome to Maggie Dwire.
I realize now when you put in your bio how long you've been working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, it dates you. And so I'd like to point out that I've actually been working for the Fish and Wildlife Service since I was 5. So that's how I have 20 years in the service. But it is the anniversary of the Endangered Species Act, and it is or the 50th anniversary. It is also the 25th anniversary this year of releasing Mexican wolves to the wild in the United States. So we have double reason to celebrate in our program. So I am happy to be here tonight, and we are quite a bit away from, I feel like I'm standing behind the screen for you guys, but we are quite a bit a ways away from the heart of where Mexican wolf recovery is occurring. So my kind of assumption is that in this room or on the audience in general, since we'll be online, is that there's some knowledge about kind of wolf issues across the country, but maybe not specific knowledge about Mexican wolf or Mexican wolf recovery. The title of the talk, make sure I know where the pointer is. The title of the talk is Back from the Brink, which sounds really exciting. And actually, Mexican wolf recovery can be told in a really exciting way. You know, we went from total persecution to restoration in the wild. It's been fraught with litigation at every turn, even romantic scandal, because wolves don't always mate for life like we kind of wanted to believe. But we've gone from 7 animals in existence to more than 600 globally, and we're on our way to becoming one of the greatest, I think, success stories ever told under the Endangered Species Act. So I'm going to give a little bit of background, kind of go through where we've been, where we're going, and what the key kind of components of our program are. And then I'd like to open it up for questions, because I do find that sort of the back and forth is more informative for people, which maybe should make me rethink my presentation strategy if I think just talking to people is more informative than me standing up here. But I would like to get to that point, and if there's time, even after that, I'll stick around for any other questions that you guys may want to ask. So as all presentations start, I would be remiss if I didn't thank our partners. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are tons and tons of partners in Mexican wolf recovery. But for the on-the-ground kind of components and the parts of recovery that I'm going to talk about tonight, these are the primary partners. So I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is under the Department of Interior, as most of you know. And some other partners that we have are USDA's Forest Service and Wildlife Services, the State Game and Fish Agencies in Arizona and New Mexico, and the White Mountain Apache Tribe, which is in Arizona. This is a binational program, and it has always been a binational program, so we have some significant key partners in Mexico. SEMERNAT and CONAP are listed here. And then none of this would be possible if it weren't for the Association of Zoos and Aquariums and the Mexican Wolf Captive Breeding Program, ultimately saving the species from extinction in the first place. So, starting with the basics, what is a Mexican wolf? What is the smallest, southernmost occurring, and most genetically distinct subspecies of gray wolf? So gray wolves in the West historically roamed from Alaska through Canada, down through the western United States into and throughout Mexico. Mexican wolves historically ranged all throughout Mexico into Arizona and New Mexico in the United States. They're smaller than their northern cousins. They're only 55 to 90 pounds. And what you see is what you get. We don't have the black color variation or the white color variation that you see in other subspecies of gray wolves. What is on the screen is what almost all of them look like to a T. It is generally kind of difficult to give a succinct presentation about Mexican wolf recovery because there are so many different components, and this is why. So in a better situation, we like to try to preserve a species in the environment in which it occurs, right? So recovery we'd like to do on the ground, protecting the species where it's at and get them to a place where they can be removed from the list of endangered species. Unfortunately for Mexican wolves, this wasn't possible. They were completely extirpated from the wild. So our recovery efforts are intrinsically tied to other populations that exist solely to support restoration and recovery in the wild. So our recovery program manages an XC2 population, which is the captive breeding program, a biobanked population, which for the purposes of this slide is meant to represent our gamete bank, which is on liquid nitrogen, and then as well as 2 wild populations. We've been recovering wolves in the wild in the United States as well as trying to reintroduce them in Mexico. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these populations. But first we have to go back a little further in time and talk about what happened. So how did we get to where we are today, right? So as settlers moved west in the 1800s, they brought with them their livestock. And the livestock began to outcompete the native ungulate herds, and wolves and other predators turned to livestock as a food resource. Obviously, this was something that we didn't enjoy, right? So there was an there was an anti-predator campaign that was led by the government in the late 1800s and early 1900s that tried to get rid of all predators on the landscape. So wolves, coyotes, bears, lions, oh my. We targeted trying to get rid of those so that we could conquer the West, so to speak. And unfortunately for wolves, that anti-predator campaign was really successful. The last Mexican wolf was killed in the wild in the United States in 1970. And at that time, there were fewer than 50 remaining in Mexico, and the population in Mexico was dwindling quickly. Ironically, the Endangered Species Act was born in 1973, and Mexican wolves were listed as endangered in 1976, and now those very same government entities that had tried so hard to rid the landscape of wolves were now being charged with restoring and recovering this highly endangered species. Again, there were no Mexican wolves left in the United States, so through collaboration with Mexico, we went down into Mexico and caught the last remaining wild Mexican wolves. Every Mexican wolf alive today can be traced back to only 7 founders. So super dangerously close to extinction. And with only 7 founders, genetics still remains one of the significant threats to the species today. In 1982, the Fish and Wildlife Service published a recovery plan for the Mexican wolf, right? This is only a handful of years after we went into Mexico and caught the last remaining few wolves. And that recovery plans are supposed to contain downlisting and delisting criteria, what's required under what conditions are required for that species in order to no longer need protections from the Endangered Species Act. And that recovery team thought the situation for Mexican wolves at the time was so dire that they couldn't foresee recovery. Those words are actually in that recovery plan. We don't have recovery criteria in here because we think the situation is so dire, we cannot foresee recovery. So instead of recovery criteria, that plan says, let's see if you can even propagate these things in captivity, right? We didn't even know that at the time. And if you can produce a captive population, a robust captive population, then try and release some to the wild. Now these are animals that have been generations removed from the wild, right, that we're trying to restore into the natural environment. And so that recovery plan said, and if your releases are successful and you get to a population of at least 100 Mexican wolves in the wild, then recovery might be possible and you should go back and do a recovery plan, right? So see if you can propagate them in captivity, see if you can get at least 100 in the wild, and then maybe recovery is possible and you should write a recovery plan that has downlisting and delisting criteria. So our captive breeding program is what the Association of Zoos and Aquarium calls a SAFE program. It stands for Saving Animals from Extinction. And the designation is important because SAFE programs are holding animals in captivity for conservation and recovery purposes, right? So some zoos, or some animals are held in zoos or other zoological institutions for exhibition purposes or education or research, but a SAFE program, they're being held in those environments specifically for conservation and recovery purposes. And our SAFE program is 60 different facilities between the United States and Mexico, and currently holds about 360 Mexican wolves. And each year we meet to discuss kind of breeding and transfer plans. Hang on a second, I'm gonna get some water. So each year we meet to discuss breeding and transfer plans, because our breeding needs to try to retain as much gene diversity as possible, right? With only 7 founders, we have to maximize our pairings so that we try to retain as much gene diversity in that population as possible. And so every year, come fall, we're flying wolves all over the country, because we use this little like kind of computer dating software that says this wolf is underrepresented in the population and needs to breed, and this wolf is underrepresented in the population, needs to breed. And they're never like 50 miles apart, right? They're never at these zoos it's always like the females at the Wolf Conservation Center in New York and the males at the Pueblo Zoo in Mexico, and we have to figure out where we're gonna fly them to so they can breed. So it's a pretty heavy-handed, significant, lots of people involved, pretty big effort to maintain this population. But as far as the 1982 plan goes, and with the question of whether or not we can propagate this species in captivity, our captive breeding program has more than knocked that out of the park. It's been so successful that it's actually used as a model for other species that are kind of dipping their toe into the captive breeding realm. So pretty award-winning and pretty remarkable program. Another population that we manage is our biobanked population. So every wolf that dies, its carcass is preserved at the University of New Mexico. So its skeleton, its pelt, different tissues, et cetera. Through time, all time, we've been doing this. The University of Mexico also holds I call it our blood bank. So every time we handle an animal, whether it's in captivity or in the wild, we draw blood from it or serum, and we store it at UNM. And this is a huge kind of research opportunity for us. If we're ever looking for trends through time, we have it. It's all archived at the University of New Mexico. We also have a gamete bank at the St. Louis Zoo and the Chapultepec Zoo in Mexico. Since the 90s, we've been collecting semen from male Mexican wolves and oocytes since about 2000 from female Mexican wolves, and preserving them on liquid nitrogen to potentially use through artificial insemination or assisted reproductive technologies going into the future. We have about 300 individual Mexican wolves represented in this gamete bank, and as far as the living population is going, all male Mexican wolves older than 5 are represented in that bank, and all female wolves older than 12 are represented in that bank. And the reason for the age discrepancy is we can collect from males opportunistically throughout the course of their life. I don't think they really think it's much of an opportunity, but it is opportunistically. But females, we have to spay them in order to harvest their oocytes, so we generally wait until they're close to reaching reproductive senescence to do that. So we've been successful using artificial insemination, or we've been successful with artificial insemination using fresh and frozen semen. And this is really important for us because the technologies aren't quite there for us to reliably use artificial insemination to kind of boost our living population. The biobanked population, because we've been storing gametes and preserving them for so long, it has some gene diversity that is no longer available in the living population. Right, our captive population is capped, right? It's a finite closed system. We don't have an infinite number of facilities, and so we're losing a little bit of gene diversity through time. And we're excited for the assisted reproductive technologies to kind of catch up with the biobanked material we have from a long time ago, because it should allow us to kind of bring some of that lost genetic diversity back into the living population, which is important, right? We only have 7 founders, so every bit of lost gene diversity is bad news for us. And something we just participated in a few months ago was a pilot study to culture somatic cells. And somatic cells are what you need for cloning. And the interesting thing about that is it's a tiny little 2 millimeter or 4 millimeter ear punch, and it produces 2 and 3 million cells from just this tiny little ear punch. And it's something we could do at any time of year, right? Semen collection has to occur during the breeding season. Oocyte collection has to occur later in a female's life, but we can collect an ear punch from an animal at any point in its life. The problem that we have with the somatic cell culturing is we can't go back in time necessarily and collect from the earlier animals. So that's where our gamete bank is going to continue to remain really important for us. But really with both types or both kind of biobanking efforts, our banking efforts are ahead of the technology that's available. And that sounds bad, but it's actually a really good thing. Most species, the technology is becoming available for us to do some of this kind of assisted reproduction stuff, but they don't have the material banked. And we go way back into the 90s. So as soon as the technology catches up, I think we'll be able to bring back some of that gene diversity that we've lost, which is pretty exciting. All right, so let's talk about wolves in the wild, because I think that's more of what people want to hear about. This is the geography of our recovery area. It used to be a lot smaller, and that will only matter for one slide about 10 slides from now for about 14 seconds, so you don't have to really commit it to memory except for that I just said it right there. But our recovery area is, wolves can be anywhere, I'm gonna see if I can do this. Wolves can be anywhere south of Interstate 40 between Arizona and New Mexico, so they can be all the way around in here. This pink area is our, they're just different management zones, but it's where we can take wolves from captivity and release them into the wild. We can do that anywhere within the pink area. They can disperse into and occupy the gray area, or we can translocate them there, which just means we go and pick them up from the pink area and move them to the gray area if we wanted to. And they can disperse into and occupy these green areas, but there's not a lot of habitat out there, so we don't really expect them to spend much time or even really occur out there. An important feature of our recovery area is all of the pink area is National Forest Service land, as well as in the gray area, the areas that are really high quality, suitable habitat are also National Forest Service lands. So we do expect the wolf population to occur, or the bulk of the wolf population to occur on National Forest Service lands, which is really important. Other land jurisdictions are of course impacted, like tribes, for example, but we work with each tribe to look at kind of what their culture and resource needs are and come up with a management plan that works for them. All right, so we have been releasing wolves to the wild since 1998. You can see that we did a lot of releases and then no releases and then a lot of releases, and that'll make sense here in a little bit. But when we started releasing wolves in 1998, again, remember there were no wolves in the wild, and we hadn't really studied Mexican wolves before they were eradicated from the wild. So we based a lot of our assumptions and expectations on other wolf programs, right? Other reintroduction programs. And we are often compared to wolf recovery in the Northern Rockies, right? And that program involved going up into Canada, grabbing some wild wolves and putting them in Yellowstone National Park or the Central Idaho Wilderness. I'm super grossly oversimplifying that. It was much more challenging than that, but those two key components of their recovery efforts, we are lacking, right? We don't have a large national park, right? Yellowstone is huge. And we don't have a huge Central Idaho Wilderness. That's a big area. Those are both large core protected areas for wolves to live in, right? So those populations did really well before they sort of left the wilderness area and the park area. The other difference is they got to go into Canada and take wild wolves and stick them down in Disneyland for children, essentially, right? We had to deal with captive stock, right? These were animals that had been in captivity for generations that we were releasing not into a national park, not into a wilderness area, but onto large swaths of federal land, which was great, but these are working landscapes, right? There was hunting, recreation, grazing, you name it. So lucky to have what we had, but certainly a different kind of environmental component than the program that we often get compared to. And so we learned a lot in trying to release these animals into the wild and trying to help them become wild. And one of the things that we learned is that our management regime, especially when the population was small, greatly impacted its success. So in the beginning, let's see if I can do this again by turning around. In the beginning, the number of releases, this is the blue line, so we were releasing 20 wolves a year to begin with, right? Trying to get the population established. The yellow line is the number of wolves that we were removing, and removing includes actually taking it out of the wild, right? Not every animal is really meant for living in the wild, or picking it up and moving it. Like, this situation here isn't working for you, so we're gonna move you over here. So you can see I've broken this out into kind of 4 phases, but the first phase, a lot of animals being released to the wild, a lot of animals being moved around or removed from the wild, but the population did really well, right? In the first 6 or so years, we went from 0 wolves to 55 wolves. That was half of what the 1982 recovery plan said, just see if you can do it. So in 5-6 years, we were like, you guys, we've made it. We are the next Northern Rockies recovery program. This is a snap. Wolves are doing great. So the number one reason to oppose having wolves on the landscape are conflicts with livestock. So when we thought we had made it, we were like, you guys, let's get really kind of aggressive and let's responsibly grow a wolf population that doesn't depredate on livestock. And we came up with a standard operating procedure or a protocol that said any wolf that kills 3 cows in a year will be removed from the wild. So sort of a 3 strikes, you're out policy. And that's what was going on in phase 2. So you can see we weren't releasing any more wolves because, again, we thought we had made it. And we were removing a lot of wolves, and these weren't moving animals around. Most of those were animals that were being removed from the wild. So when your population is kind of oscillating between 40 and 60 wolves, which is what we saw during this time, and you're year after year after year removing 20 wolves from the wild, it's not going to grow, right? There's adding to the population, removing to the population. We can all do a little bit of math. The population's not going to do very well if you keep removing, about half of your animals every year. So we knew we had to change, but we had made a commitment to our stakeholders and the people on the ground that we would manage aggressively for livestock depredations. And we couldn't take that away unless we replaced it with something else. And so around 2009, we did take that protocol away, and instead of being reactive and removing wolves for coming into conflict with livestock, we changed to be proactive and tried to prevent the depredations from occurring in the first place. And it, thankfully, really worked, right? So you can see our releases are still at basically nothing, but removals dropped to almost nothing, right? We were preventing wolves from depredating on cattle and therefore not needing to remove or even move very many wolves. And the population did great under this management regime, right? It started to grow again. And something that's important is we reached that at least 100 wolves that the 1982 recovery plan was like, if you can do it, then you should go back to the drawing board and come up with a recovery plan for the species. And so that's what we did essentially in phase 4. At the beginning of phase 4, we vastly expanded our recovery area. It was really small. Now it's what I showed just a few slides ago, about 2/3 of Arizona and New Mexico. And in 2017, we published a recovery plan for the species that included downlisting and delisting criteria. And so this was a great kind of accomplishment for us because for 20 years almost, we'd been releasing wolves on the landscape with no goalposts, right? And the Northern Rockies program was growing like crazy. We can't figure out how to delist wolves. And so our local community was starting to worry, like, this Mexican wolf population is just going to grow and grow and grow, and we have no idea where the end is. And so being able to tell our partners and being able to have goals for ourselves and what we're aiming for, is really important. And it's a little bit embarrassing that it took almost about 20 years of putting wolves on the ground before we could get there. So this is where we are today. Our goals in that recovery plan is, so we have an abundance criteria and we have genetics criteria. The abundance goals is that we would like to see at least 320 wolves in the United States and at least 200 wolves in Mexico. Our last count, which occurred at the end of 2022, we had reached just over 240 wolves in the United States, and Mexico reported about 20. I'm going to talk about Mexico towards the end, but one thing I would like for you guys to just see here is that if you give Mexico the same start date as us, their curve looks pretty similar to ours, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I get there. But the genetics component of our recovery plan matters, right? So it says that, and it's a little bit hard to explain it the way that it's written, but we need to release 22 wolves, or we need 22 wolves that are released from the captive breeding program to survive to breeding age in the United States. And this is just, we've released obviously many more wolves than that, but this is just since that recovery plan was written. So 22 wolves that are released from captivity into the wild in the United States need to survive to breeding age. And for breeding age, so that's for a pup, it needs to survive 2 years in the wild until it reaches sexual maturity. And for an adult, we need it to survive at least a year in the wild before we can say it's incorporated into the population. And Mexico has the same metric, but they need to release enough wolves such that 37 of them are surviving to breeding age. And the reason for this is because we have a genetics problem, right? With only 7 founders, things are grim to begin with. And we have an issue in that our SAFE program, right, the captive breeding program, is more genetically diverse than our wild population. So, right, our wild population is lacking some of the gene diversity that's represented in the captive population. And recovery is all about in the wild, right? So we need the wild population to have all the gene diversity that's available, not the captive population and not the banked population, but the wild population. And so we need to continue releasing wolves from captivity in order to boost the genetics of the wild population. So it's something I forgot to show. Oh, I guess maybe it doesn't go backwards. Is that here in phase 4, you can see we start doing releases again, and we can actually start doing some removals or more removals than we had been doing, and the population's still doing well, right? So when you have a population of 200 wolves and you remove 20 of them, it's a much different effect on the population than if you have 40 wolves and you're removing 20 of them. So, so just to recap that we don't need to do releases of wolves to make that green line grow. We don't need to continue releasing wolves in order to give the population an abundance boost. It's a genetics boost that we're looking for. But of course, everything with wolf recovery has to be hard, and we do not have support to do releases of wolves, right? We don't have political support, we don't have partnership support, we don't have stakeholder support. I shouldn't say it that aggressively. It's very hard to get the support to do releases of wolves. And the reason for that is that actually has some merit. And I'll try to explain it this way. So wolves are territorial, right? And so if we're gonna release a new pack of wolves, we can't put it in the wild where other wolves already exist. So we have to put it into a new area that's absent wolves. And the way our wolf occupancy is on the landscape is all of those areas that are absent wolves haven't had wolves yet. So if we release wolves into that area, that's those stakeholders and landowners, that's their first experience with wolves, or the animals that we're putting in that area. And 40% of the nuisance behavior that we document in our population comes from animals that are recently released from captivity. So for a program where we already have trouble gaining support, to even have wolves on the landscape, putting these naive, kind of prone to nuisance behavior wolves in an area where that is, those landowners and those stakeholders' first experience with the animal, it's not our best foot forward. Right? So our population's growing and it's doing really well, and the idea of now putting these naive animals into these areas and causing all of these conflicts isn't real popular. But we need to do it, right, to achieve recovery. We need that genetic boost to the population. So luckily, in 2016, we started a new kind of release methodology, and it's pup fostering. So we take these captive-born, more genetically diverse pups when they're 5 to 15 days old, and we insert them into a wild den of similarly aged pups, and then they're raised in the wild by experienced wolves. I'm also grossly oversimplifying that. It is a huge amount of coordination between the captive breeding program and our wild population, right? So in captivity, we generally know when wolves breed because we're watching them. And then we can say, about 63 days later, that pack's gonna have a litter of puppies. Great, we can mark it on the calendar. But in the wild population, we don't see these animals breed. We can't see them every day, for sure. And so the way we document the females breeding is by denning behavior, right? So packs are moving around, and then, the female's in a location, and the next day the female's in a location. And you do that for like 5 or 6 days, and you can be pretty certain that she must be denning, right? After about a week's time, you're pretty certain she's not leaving this tiny, they're moving around on the landscape, and then they're not when they den. But if we're trying to do this between, when the animals are 5 and 15 days old, and it takes us 7 days to document that a female in the wild is denning, we've already lost like half of our time, to get this done. And so what generally happens is we document these wild females denning, and then we scramble and we look to the captive breeding program and try to figure out if there are any litters anywhere that match this, age difference. And then we work really fast. It's a very quick thing where we're on the phone. We have a volunteer pilot organization called Lighthawk that donates these flights to us, and they go all over the country retrieving these pups from our captive breeding facilities. And like this year, we brought them in from New York, Chicago, and St. Louis. And so they're flying them all the way to Arizona or New Mexico, where these puppies are then put in a truck and driven 4 hours into the middle of the forest. And then they're stuck in a backpack where they're hiked another couple hours up into this area where the wolves are denning. And we pull all the puppies out of the natal den, and we mix them all together and make them all smell the same, because we think we're fooling the mom into thinking that they're hers. And then we stick them all back in the hole, and the female comes back, and generally she will move the puppies to a new location, because, I mean, she's obviously probably, is aware of there was a den disturbance. But she moves them to a new location, and then they're raised in the wild by experienced wolves. And this has, well, I'm going to say it has 3 benefits. One benefit is that it's super fun to do when the puppies are really cute. So that's one benefit. But one of the real benefits is that these dens are already in the wild, right? We're not putting wolves into new places. These dens are in an area where we have relationships with the stakeholders and the landowners on the ground. All we're doing is effectively changing the composition of the litter. We're not really doing anything else. But the biggest benefit really is that these animals are raised in, these genetically diverse captive animals are raised in the wild by experienced wolves, which completely eliminates the nuisance behavior that we see if we do this with adult wolves. So huge benefit to our program, and it's what allows us to continue doing releases of wolves. So we've done enough of them now to kind of try to talk about whether or not it's working. We just finished our foster season, like 5 days ago, I think, and almost reached 100. We were one shy of getting 100 puppies from the captive program out into the wild. So we had 99 pups that have been moved from captivity to the wild, and at least 14 of them have survived to breeding age. And so we know that this method is working for us to get to that at least 22 wolves surviving to breeding age, right? And there will be no need to stop at 22. We can keep doing fostering kind of as long as we want to, or until we feel that we've made the genetic impact on the wild population that we need to make. We do feel through modeling that that's at about 22 wolves surviving to breeding age. What else was I gonna say about that? Oh, I know what I was going to say. So the challenge, though, that we're experiencing now is that there are probably more than 14 that have survived to breeding age. The hard part for us is, when we put these animals, these puppies, into a den, they weigh about as much as a potato, right? And so you're sticking them in a hole in the middle of the forest, in the middle of nowhere, and then some point over the course of the next 2 years of your life, you need to document that they're still alive so that you can count them as surviving to breeding age. And so in the we do camera trapping, but in the late summer and early fall, we'll actually set traps, to try to catch some of the animals that might be surviving with that pack. And same with our aerial survey in the winter. We fly over every radio-collared wolf and we count the uncollared wolves with it, and we try to dart some of them if it's a pack that we fostered into. But if we don't catch these pups generally in their first year of life, we start to lose track of them, right? They disperse from their pack, and so it's more opportunistic after that we're able to document that they've survived. So it's one thing that we're trying to get better at, but we do know that at least 14 have survived to breeding age. We do know that this method of release is working for us to get the right genes into the wild population, so that's a really good thing. All right, so I mentioned that our population, we were kind of able to turn things around when we went from being reactive and removing wolves for conflicts with livestock to being proactive and trying to prevent depredations from happening. This is the bulk of the field work that we do today, is trying to prevent depredations from happening. But I do want to kind of take a step back and point out that 80% of the Mexican wolf's diet is elk. Right, so 80% of the time they're eating what they're supposed to be eating, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, but a lot of our conversation is about the wolf-livestock conflict. So it starts to feel like, man, are you just releasing these animals into the wild and then they're eating cows and you're somehow calling this, a success? Well, that's not entirely what's happening, right? So 80% of the time they're doing the right thing, but about 10 or 15% of the time, or their diet is cattle. And, it can be higher or it can be lower depending on the different situations, but the wolf livestock conflict, or the conflicts with wolves and livestock, is a centuries old issue, right? It's completely ingrained in the culture and the attitudes towards wolves. And it's why we got rid of wolves in the first place. It's why many people don't want them back today. So, even though 80% of the time wolves are doing the right thing, the other percentage of the time is really important for us to try to mitigate. And so a lot of our recovery, or a lot of our field work, is actually trying to prevent wolves from killing cattle. There are several ways that we do this. One is that we haze the animals, right? If wolves are in an area where we think they're going to get into conflict, we just kind of go in there and make their lives a little miserable, right? Sometimes that's just hiking in and scaring them out. Sometimes it's using rubber bullets or beanbag rounds or firecrackers, but just something that's like, this isn't, to get them to think, this place kind of sucks, I'm going to go somewhere else. So that's one, when we do it. We also do hire range riders. So the allotments in the Southwest are very, very big. So this idea that, ranchers should be out riding their herd every day that's really romantic. But they're very busy people, right? They can't go out and ride these huge allotments every day. And so we hire range riders to basically go out and ride these huge allotments every day. And the goal, actually, with most of these proactive management efforts is to create some time and space between wolves and cows. And so that's what a range rider does. They're doing some of the hazing. If a lot of times, wolves and cattle will share a water source, so they'll bring the cattle to the water and then move them away so that there's no conflicts at the water source. But this is really helpful to our livestock producers in the area because it allows them to kind of do some other things rather than just riding their herd all day. Our denning season can be problematic, right? So wolves are locked to a hole in the ground for many, many weeks while they raise their pups, and they're going to want to eat what's closest to them or most vulnerable and close to them. And so during the denning season, we work with the Forest Service and with our permittees to look at their pasture rotations and try to see if we can rotate cows away from wolves when they're denning, especially if the cows are calving, right? We want those small calves to be as far away from the den site as possible, and if they must be brought close to the den, then we want it to be when the calves are old enough to be kind of, more protected and more defensible, or less vulnerable, I guess I should say. And this has worked really, really well for us. And in some cases, we will work with permittees if they're willing to bring their cows in to calve in a smaller pasture, right? So a small area that we can actually defend. We'll buy hay and supplemental feed for the cows so that those calves can be raised in that small kind of protected area until they're big enough to go out onto the landscape and not be so vulnerable. One challenge that we have, I feel like I say this a lot, like we have an added challenge in the Southwest, and I guess that's kind of true. We do have an added challenge in the Southwest. One is the allotments are huge, right? So they're hard to protect your cattle within them. And the other one is that we don't have the harsh winters that you see in a lot of other places. So in most places, cattle are taken off the landscape in the winter. In Arizona and New Mexico, there's a small part of Arizona where that happens, but mostly in Arizona and New Mexico, that's not the case. Cattle are on the ground year-round. There's year-round grazing, and so that's year-round opportunity for conflict. And a little bit even more of a struggle for us is in New Mexico specifically, there's year-round calving. So there's vulnerable calves on the landscape almost all year. So the opportunity for conflict is high. And we can't always mitigate it, right? We can't always move cows away from wolves. We can't always hire range riders, or it's not all the time that these are effective techniques. So something we do resort to is what we call a diversionary food cache, which is what the image is actually on the screen. And if we can't mitigate a conflict, or we have a kind of a chronic depredation area going on, we will provide what we call a diversionary food cache. And it's basically, we're just feeding that pack, once or twice a week to try to reduce their need to prey on something. We'll provide, these are carnivore logs is what they're called. It's just like a gross meat hot dog thing. And, or like a roadkill deer or elk or something, for the pack to eat. And what we're trying to do is just reduce their need to prey on what's nearby until we can kind of fix the situation that we're dealing with. And this has really helped us leave wolves on the landscape, right? It's really helped us remove or reduce that removal rate. Is when we get into these chronic situations, we actually just start feeding the wolves until we can fix what else is happening. A lot of people ask how all of this is paid for. A lot of things go into it, but there is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grant that offers funding for prevention activities and compensation. And these grants require a 1-to-1 non-federal match. So when ranchers move their cattle, that's not a cheap thing. So that's considered match for these grants, and the states put in money. So there's a lot of different organizations and entities and people putting money into this program. And there is a compensation program, so if wolves are killing cattle, ranchers do get reimbursed full market value for the livestock that are lost to wolves through these programs. So. All right, so as you can see, it is a pretty, I would like to say, actively managed population. I think some people say heavily managed population. You know, in the spring, we're fostering puppies into the wild. In the summer and fall, we're trying to trap to document new pack formation or puppy survival. And then in the winter, you know, we're doing our aerial population survey where we're flying over all of the radio-collared wolves and counting the uncollared wolves with them, darting some of the uncollared wolves and placing collars on them. Every animal that we catch is vaccinated. We draw blood on it. The blood is preserved in the biobank. It's sent off to the lab to monitor the health of the population, and it's sent to our DNA lab so that we can keep a handle on who's who in the population, right? With genetics the way they are, we're trying to keep a handle on you know, who each wolf is. As far as monitoring goes, half of our population is radio collared, and that is extremely high. Or I should say it's a lot. Most wolf populations want like 1 to 2 collars per pack. And honestly, that is our goal. We say we want 1 to 2 collars per pack, but I think we're kind of addicted to the data, and we keep radio collaring all of, you know, every time we catch an animal, we're gonna radio collar it, right? So our radio collars have the VHF technology, which is just you hear beeps on your receiver, and they also have the GPS technology, so you can log onto your computer and see where they all are. This is kind of a zoomed out version of just like 1 collar per pack, because I wanted to show you guys. This is New Mexico. Sorry, I turned around and I lost my east and west. This is New Mexico, and this is Arizona, and that's essentially I-40. So this is basically our recovery area. All of this, you know, the kind of the green forested areas is good wolf habitat. So you can see our 240 wolves are not using, or our 240 wolves are not, you know, super spread out on the landscape and using all of the area. We have a lot of room for more wolves, which is great. And I think it's interesting when you zoom in, these are different packs. You can see how closely our packs, how densely occupying the area they are, right? All of these packs are interacting to some degree. Well, I mean, they're separate, right? But they have to know that each other are there. We don't see a lot of the inner pack strife, you know, wolves killing wolves that other populations are seeing. And that is probably because, you know, when you go back to something like this, there are about 80,000 elk in the recovery area and only 240 wolves. So they're not really competing for food yet, right? There's not a lot of reason for this pack to fight with this pack to fight with this pack, at least yet. We don't think that food resource, or that we think that the food available is enough to keep our wolves from killing one another, since they're living this closely, essentially. All right, so we fly around in helicopters and we tackle our wolves, and we slap radio collars on them, and we trap them with leg hold traps, and we stick needles in them and put radio collars on them. That's all really invasive monitoring, right? We do a lot of non-invasive monitoring as well. And so like if we have a collared pack of wolves, a lot of times we'll set up camera traps so that we can get pictures of the different wolves traveling with it. This is how we document whether or not some of our fostered pups have survived. Another big program we have is that we do scat collection and that's mostly to try to keep a handle on who's who in the population. Sometimes we have like the breeding alpha female collared, and therefore her blood and her DNA has been analyzed, but the male maybe we haven't caught yet. And so because we only have 7 founders and because we have a genetics component to our criteria, we really need to know how we're doing in that area. So we will collect scat at the den sites and stuff to be able to kind of keep track. We can run DNA on the scat and try to keep track of who's who in our population. Another part of our management are removals. So this again includes removing an animal from the wild as well as moving it to another area in the wild. And this slide is becoming moot. So the blue area is removing animals for conflicts with livestock. That's going to be a reality in our program going forward, right? Either moving them or removing them. The gray area, this is really exciting, you guys. Remember when I said it was only going to come up in one slide later, that our recovery area used to be smaller? Here it is. The anticipation's over. Our recovery area used to be really small, and we used to remove a lot of wolves for going outside the boundary. So we would just go grab them and bring them back. So that's going to go down because our recovery area is really big now. We're not really going to do that anymore. And then the orange area is removing wolves for nuisance behavior. And now that we're not releasing adult wolves, that portion of the pie is going to go down too. So this slide, I'm saying it becomes moot because all that's really going to be left is moving animals around or removing them from the wild for livestock issues. What we do with the animal matters. So every time we need to move or remove an animal, we will kind of evaluate its potential future contribution to recovery and decide where it needs to go. And so the blue, it's weird that it's behind me. The blue section is some situations are egregious or need to be managed aggressively very quickly. So we do some lethal controls of animals. It's not very many, but we can and will do it. The orange area, it's orange on my screen, but it looks kind of brown up there. The orange area those are the animals that we pick them up in our recovery area in a situation where we say, this isn't working out for you, so we're going to move you over here, right? That's just translocating it to another area within our recovery area. The yellow portion of the pie is sometimes we pick the animal up and its value is best served in retaining it in the captive breeding program, right? So it'll actually go back into a zoo or a zoological institution. And the gray area, this section of the pie will actually get bigger through time, and that's that we'll actually translocate it to Mexico. And so most of the time now, if we want to move one of our animals to just another area, right, this isn't working out for you, our population's doing really well. Mexico's trying to get off the ground. So sometimes it's better if we actually take one of our wolves or a pack of our wolves and move it to Mexico for release to the wild. So I do expect that gray area to grow. All right, so mortalities are a reality, and the number one source of mortality in our population is by far human-caused mortality, and mostly in the form of illegal gunshot. And that's not unique to our population. Most wolf populations, the number one cause of mortality is human-caused mortality. Wolf populations can actually withstand a pretty high rate of human-caused mortality, and as long as it doesn't go over that threshold, the population can still grow. And while this looks really bad, right, human-caused mortality is really high, or the highest form of mortality in our population, that's what we're seeing currently in our population, is that it is not occurring at a high enough rate to prevent our population from growing or achieving recovery, which is great. I mean, it's not great that they're dying, but it's great that it's not hurting our ability to grow the population and achieve recovery. All right, so Mexico. Mexico started releasing wolves in 2011, and they analyzed 6 different sites for release, and they are currently working in this northwesternmost site. You can see the red line on the screen is essentially that blue line I asked you to remember and kind of shift it over to match our start date. It's a little squished, so it looks like it's higher peaked. But that kind of matches the trajectory that we saw when we started releasing wolves. The yellow line is the number of releases that they've done. They don't do removals of wolves, or they haven't really had to do removals of wolves yet. But their release pattern of releasing, kind of 4 or 5 wolves for the first few years, that's not going to get a population established. A couple wolves here and there is not going to work. But then they released 17 wolves, and then 0 wolves, and then 13 wolves, and then 0 wolves, and then 12 wolves, and then 0 wolves. And that release pattern is really erratic, and it's not working, right? So in order to get wolves to establish on the landscape, you need to keep putting them out. Not every wolf, actually probably only about 30% of them, actually make it when we release them into the wild. And so we need, in order for the population to really gain foothold and grow on its own, Mexico needs to kind of improve or decrease the erraticness, I guess, of their release strategy. So that's something that we're trying to help Mexico with. There is a reason for that, though, and there are challenges in Mexico that we didn't have to face. One of them is that, I might complain that we don't have a large national park or an Idaho wilderness area, but I am really thankful that we are working on huge swaths of public, National Forest Service land. In Mexico, about 95% of their recovery areas are privately owned. And so in order for them to do a release of wolves, they need the landowner's consent and the neighboring landowner's consent. So that's a lot to get, even just one pack out. And to do it year after year after year is proving a bit challenging for Mexico, to get the landowner agreements to do that. Another challenge Mexico faces is the use of poison. So it's illegal in Mexico, just as it is in the United States, but it is still used. It's not intentionally targeting wolves, it's more that it's targeting coyotes, but it's an indiscriminate killer, right? So when we started trying to reestablish a population, it was really hard to get captive wolves to survive on the landscape, right? It takes about 4 months for them to be appropriately afraid of people, and things, that was a big challenge for us. When you have poison on the ground, it doesn't matter if your wolf is the wildest of wild wolves. If it comes into contact with poison, it can't win, right? So Mexico has to address this issue of poison if we really expect this population to get off the ground. Another kind of interesting challenge that Mexico has is that the wolf habitat, wolves like large forested green areas, right? And so in Mexico, some of those large forested green areas, the cartels also like. And so it's not safe for their biologists to work in some of those environments. And a lot of times they'll release wolves in this area and they'll disperse into and occupy an area where it's maybe not safe for their biologists to work. And it's fine, the wolves are doing fine in that area, but we're not able to go in there and document that they've had pups or count how many animals they have. So Mexico's end of year population count, last year they reported only 20 wolves. It's definitely not as accurate as ours, because sometimes that's occurring. So that's some of the challenges that we face in Mexico. All right, so most species are in danger of extinction because of something that's really challenging to fix, right? Habitat degradation, invasive species, climate change, and none of these exist for wolves, which is great, right? The reason wolves are endangered is because people don't like them, right? Biologically, they might be one of the easy species to recover, right? All they need is enough food to eat and for people to tolerate their presence. So in that regard, I think that highlights the importance of working with people in our program. It's by far not a biological issue. Wolves are doing fine. And so I think the take-home message I'd like for you guys to hear is that in the US, our population in the wild is thriving, right? And with a little bit of help from the captive population and the biobank population, it's going to get to the point where it is meaningfully contributing to the recovery, delisting and recovery of the species. And now, because the captive population is stable, the biobank is robust, and our wild population in the US is doing really well, we're now starting to turn our focus to assisting Mexico and getting kind of over their hump and over their challenges so that they can also meaningfully contribute to recovery as well. So with that, I will open it up for questions. There are any, yes.
Turning this on so you can hear me.
Oh, look at that. Look at you.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to know about those translocated individuals. Are they welcomed into packs? Do they end up loners? How does that go typically?
Yeah, so translocation, I guess it depends on what we're translocating. So sometimes we will pick up a whole pack and move it. So a lot of the translocations we do to Mexico are that. We'll pick up a pair of wolves that's in an area in our recovery area that, might have a conflict, and so we'll pick them up and move them to Mexico, and they generally stay together. If we're just picking up an animal and moving it kind of to another area in our population or in our recovery area, it's effectively like dispersing, right? So wolves disperse usually shortly after sexual maturity. So, and that is a dangerous time for wolves, right? Packs are safe, hunting in your home range is safe, and sort of bouncing around on the landscape by yourself can be a little dangerous, but it is a natural behavior for them to wander around the landscape in search of, their own mate, and they're forming their own pack. So we do see quite a bit of success actually when we translocate wolves into a new area, either as pairs or packs or individuals. Yeah.
I apologize. I have a couple questions.
Oh boy.
I hope you don't mind. My first question is, have you considered the possibility, I'm sure you have, but is there a reason why you don't microchip the pups that you're introducing from captivity into the wild?
We do microchip.
You do microchip them? Okay.
And so when we catch them later, hopefully we can scan them and know right away if it's a fostered pup. For some reason, and I think for some reason, when we put these microchips in at 5 to 15 days old, they seem to back out more than when we do it as adult. And I don't want to take responsibility for it, but I'm sure it's operator error. It is really hard to take a little 5-day-old puppy, and those are big needles, and stick it, so I think maybe we're not getting it in all the way, but yeah, we do microchip.
Okay.
Same with radio collaring, we microchip every animal that we
Very
handle.
cool. My second question, sorry, is do you have any sort of collaboration with the farmers where they're encouraged to come up with their own wolf avoidance measures, like certain kinds of fences or livestock guardian dogs?
Yeah, so part of the prevention activities so they can apply for prevention funds to implement some of those things. Specific to what you just asked about, we have a challenge in the Southwest, and then our allotments are really big, so the cattle are really spread apart. So a lot of the techniques like llamas or dogs don't work in our area. Thankfully, we do not have many, I'm going to even say any sheep in our recovery area, because when the sheep are consolidated, that's where those techniques work. But to kind of more directly answer your question, there is a pay for presence program, which is meant to incentivize the presence of wolves. And so it's a formula or mathematical formula that basically says you can get funding, and it's based on how many head of livestock you have and whether or not your allotments overlap with a home range of wolves, you get some money for that. If they overlap with a den area for wolves, you get more money for that. And then the incentive part of it is that if that pack raises pups to the end of the year, you get money per pup that is documented at the end of the year. So the idea is to kind of try to build this, like we recognize that wolves are having an impact on livestock. And it's not just that wolves might kill a cow, which they would get paid for, but they reduce reproductive rates, right? They're a predator on the landscape, so they could result in weight loss of the animals and less value when that cow goes to market. And so it's kind of meant to try to compensate for the undocumented losses as well as incentivize the presence of wolves.
Cool. I have two more, but you can take someone else's question.
Okay. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm curious if you can speak to the perceptions of stakeholders that you've experienced over time, like how that's changed. Like if people overall are becoming more open to the presence of wolves generally. And specifically, I'm curious about your tribal partners. You listed the White Mountain Apache as a primary partner, and I'm curious what you've gleaned from conversations with them about how open they are to reintroduction.
Okay. Help me if I don't get all of this answered. Butt in and let me know. I do think that attitudes have shifted a little bit towards I'm going to say towards our program. I don't think attitudes towards wolves have really changed, but there's a kind of a common anti-government sentiment of, we got rid of the animals and now you're trying to put them back. And, we had, there was a timber industry in the area, and then the Mexican spotted owl was listed, and, kind of the feeling is that killed the timber industry. And now it's a livestock economy, and now we're releasing wolves, and we're going to, so there is kind of, I think more of the attitude is against, us putting something there that they don't want anymore. But living and dealing with wolves, I think that attitude has kind of changed, and some of that is because they're not dealing with captive animals anymore. Our population is entirely wild now, and there is a little bit of a behavioral difference, but there's also, I think, some change because we've been there for so long. We being the biologists living and working in the area, but also the wolves have been there for a long time, so they're maybe a little bit more accepted as a part of the landscape, but I wouldn't say with any confidence that the actual attitudes towards the species has really changed, right? And then as far as our tribal working relationships, so the White Mountain Apache tribe, I'm tempted to go back to a map. It's a very big, the Fort Apache Indian Reservation is very big. It's like 4.4 million acres. It's a really large reservation. And they have signed on to monitoring and managing Mexican wolves, like I think since 2000 or 2002. So they've been a partner for a really long time and a very valuable partner. One of the reasons is because that reservation is donut holed by our recovery area. So they're going to have wolves, whether we like it or not. So it's very nice that they want wolves. The San Carlos Apache tribe, which is immediately south of the White Mountain, and it's equally large. It doesn't have as much habitat on it by far. It's only got kind of a corner of habitat. But right now, our agreement with the tribe is that we will remove wolves that that establish wholly on the reservation, right? Wolves are going to move around and not be there for very long sometimes, but if they, are denning on the tribe, we'll remove them. But we have lots of other kind of smaller tribes in our recovery area, and most of the time wolves are moving through those reservations, not generally staying there. That may change through time, but we have good working relationships with all the tribes in the recovery area, but I would say White Mountain is really the most impacted, and they're, they have wolf biologists and wolf technicians hired, and they're part of our team and stuff, so it's great. Did I get it all? Okay, yeah.
Thanks for a great talk.
Good.
And as you've said at the beginning, there's quite a lot of successes in this program, and looking at those recovery criteria, you guys are hitting or coming close to hitting a lot of them, at least within the U.S., right?
Yeah.
This question is not about delisting or downlisting. But as you start to really hit a lot of those goalposts, how do you foresee, or do you foresee, some of this really intensive management changing or shifting? Like, what's coming?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I kind of made the joke that we are addicted to data, right? It's so fun. Like when I first started as a biologist, I was driving all around the recovery area listening to beeps on the, hopefully listening to beeps, and then coming back with like one location that I could put in, and it took me all day to get it for, 2 packs or something. And now that we have this GPS, see, I just dated myself again. I have to stop doing that. Now that we have this GPS technology, we can log onto our computers and see where they've been for the last 24 hours. And it's because we have such an intensively managed program right now, we're addicted to the data, but we also kind of need the data, right? A lot of the permittees, livestock producers and stuff in the area, they want to know where the wolves are too. But as we get to a point where we're reaching recovery criteria, or we're even downlisting, it's not going to be as critical for us to protect every single pack that's out there, or prevent depredations from every single pack that's out there. The way that we would prevent depredations eventually going forward is to just issue permits to ranchers to say, take care of it yourself, which sounds really harsh, but that's a good sign of success, right? When our population is big enough to where we're not freaking out every time and having to run every different direction trying to fix everything. So we do know that we are going to need to step back, and a lot of that will be once our population is genetically robust enough, and once it is population-wise abundant enough, we will hand over some of that management either to the states or to people who want permits to do some of that for us. So our recovery criteria is we want at least 320 wolves in the United States and at least 200 in Mexico, both with a genetic component that needs to be met, but that's when we think that we've recovered the subspecies. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So I was wondering, how is the service working to kind of build support from those in Mexico, the landowners, to try to encourage or, I guess, help the population increase over there? And then also, if you can speak on Mr. Goodbar, I'm a big fan. I haven't heard any updates on him, so I would like to hear how he's doing.
That's funny. So we haven't dipped into working specifically with the landowners in Mexico yet. Mexico is, right? So we work with our kind of federal and state counterparts in Mexico. So we haven't taken it upon ourselves as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to go tell landowners in Mexico, what to do, but we are working more closely with Mexico more and more now in trying to figure out ways to help them get over the hump. So that'll certainly be something that we try to tackle. So Mr. Goodbar, okay, so we don't name our Mexican wolves, that we monitor in the wild population. They all get a stud book number, which is, just as fun and as cute as a name to most of us. But so when we foster these puppies out from the captive breeding program to the wild, the captive breeding program can and does name the wolves. And it's great because they can actually raise a lot of money by saying, you know, for $2,500, you can name one of our wolf puppies that's getting released to the wild. So it's really helpful for them. But so one pup that came from the Sedgwick County Zoo, I think, they had named Mr. Goodbar. His stub book number is 1888. He grew up in the wild, or was raised in the wild, and he actually dispersed from his pack and went down to the border of the United States and Mexico, and then for 5 miles walked along the border and then went back up. And I think my correct talking point is I can't speculate what he was doing, but it was along a portion of the border where there's a border wall. So looked like he was, you know, walking along the border wall. And he came back up. And later he was shot in his hind leg, and he was limping, and we caught him and we brought him in, and the Rio Grande Zoo in Albuquerque amputated his leg. They do fine. Our vets say that they're basically 3-legged animals with a spare. So I appreciate the but I don't want you guys to worry. But so anyway, it was amputated, and he's been released to the wild, and I don't know why, but this wolf moves far, and he's got 3 legs, and he's moving far. He's just dispersing all over the place. He's bumping into other packs, and he is not picking up a friend, and I can't figure out why. But so we have a soft spot in our heart for him too. We just watch him wander all over the recovery area. He's doing really well, but he hasn't found a mate yet. Yeah. All right.
Hi. I just want, it's kind of a clarifying question. When you bring in those pups to be fostered by the wild moms, how are you like switching them out? Like, how are you not overloading the mom with puppies, right?
Yeah.
Like, they only have so many teats. You don't want the babies to like be malnourished because of, you gave them too many or something.
Yeah, we've had lots of different philosophical conversations about what the right strategy is here. So when we first started fostering puppies, we were just adding 2, right? We'd take 2 from the captive population and stick them in a wild den because we thought, you know, a mom can handle 2 more. But we wanted to do more, right? We want to get more, it's slow, right? And it takes 2 years for these animals to be able to contribute to the population through the pup production of their own. So we're like, we got to do more than just 2. And then this thing came along called COVID. And the pandemic, we were like, we don't want to be near each other. You know, we can't just do 2 here and 2 there and 2 there. So the pandemic actually kind of forced us to try to be more aggressive and put more in. And so we decided, you know, average litter size is 4 to 6, but the biggest litter we've seen in the wild was like 8 or 10, I can't remember. And so we're like, we'll go to that. We'll bring puppies and we'll just go to the big litter size. And we started thinking like, okay, well maybe we'll also try to make the captive pups like a little older so that if there is nipple competition, maybe they'll be a little bit stronger. And you know, we've had all these things going on. And then this past year, we changed it to where we said, okay, well maybe we actually need to reduce the nipple competition we'll put the captive puppies in this den but the maximum litter size we want is 6. And so we're going to take some of those wild pups out and go put them in another wild den, right? And so we would increase the litter size to 6. And everything and nothing works, right? So some situations you took it up to 10 and all of the puppies survived, and some situations you took it up to 10 and only 1 did. So we don't have a good handle on what is actually working, we just know it's working. And so yeah, we've tried lots of different things, and we're willing to try almost anything. But I think the neat part of it is that wolves are good moms, kind of no matter what we're doing, and that's why that foster program works, right? So, all right, back to you.
I'm gonna give a fun question for starting off.
This isn't fun?
No,
so far?
a fun answer
Oh,
for
okay.
you.
I'm having
So
fun.
I visited the California Wolf Center twice now,
Uh-huh.
and they do a really good job of explaining like the red wolf program, or not red wolf, sorry, Mexican wolf program.
Like they do? They don't even have red wolves.
I know, right? My point is, I was told on the behavioral enrichment tour that one of the strategies for putting these pups into these wild litters is you take a big bag, put all the pups in them, and shake them. Is that true?
Huh, no. Isn't this a never shake a baby? No, we don't shake them. We do mix them together, and we make them pee and poo on each other, and
They
we
did
grab
mention that,
material
yes.
from the den, and we do that. But I went to UC San Diego and actually worked at the California Wolf Center when I was in college, and so I will have to talk to them about the shaken baby syndrome message that they're giving out.
They did definitely specify you make them pee and poop on each other.
Yeah,
so
no, we don't. I mean, we do tend to pull them out of the den in a pillowcase because
that might be where they got it.
yeah, because it's hard you're army crawling into this tiny little hole, and it's really hard to army crawl backwards with something in your hand. And so we will get in there and shove all the puppies in a pillowcase and then army crawl with just the pillowcase. But yeah, there's no shaking. Okay?
One more.
I'll be here all night. I'm just kidding. Yeah.
I'll let someone else do it.
Paying attention. So the fair market value is the value of that animal if it was sold on the market that day. So if it's a calf, it's as if it was sold as a calf, not as if it was raised and sold as an adult. And same with, obviously, it's an adult. And then the other portion of your question, I'm trying to remember. What was it? Oh, burden of proof. All right, so at least in Arizona and New Mexico, and states can do it differently. So USDA's Wildlife Services goes out and investigates the dead cow, and they determine if it was killed by wolves. So they look for, scat and tracks and stuff in the area, and they look for bite spread measurements and subcutaneous hemorrhaging, that shows that the animal was alive when it was attacked. There are different kind of various things to look at. So Wildlife Services determines if it was a wolf kill, and we help determine which wolf or wolves might have done it.
Thank you, Maggie.
All right, thank you.
So welcome to our Conservationists in Action series, a title we borrowed from Rachel Carson, actually, who came up with it in the 40s. And today we're going to spend a few minutes talking to Maggie Dwire. Maggie, thank you for coming out. She is, I want to get the title accurate, she is the Deputy Mexican Wolf Recovery Coordinator, and she's come out to NCTC to give a public lecture tonight on the topic of Back from the Brink, the Mexican Wolf Recovery Program, and we're very excited to have you here, Maggie.
Great, I'm excited to be here.
And the first question is, what did you study, and how did you end up pursuing a field of wildlife biology?
I went to college at the University of California at San Diego, and I studied biological anthropology and environmental science. And my undergrad advisor was on the board it's a place called the California Wolf Center. It's out in Julian, California. And it's a captive breeding facility that held Mexican wolves at the time. And so he suggested that I volunteer there for some work experience. And I did. And kind of randomly, different doors started to open. I was sort of intent on staying near the ocean, right? And UC San Diego has Scripps Institute of Oceanography there, and one of my goals was to work with wildlife, but near the water. I've completely failed at that because now I live and work in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is nowhere near any water.
Right.
So when I was an intern at that facility, I met the person who had my job, the job that I have now. And she suggested that I come do an internship with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I didn't even know what the Fish and Wildlife Service was. So after college, I went and did a 6-month internship in our field program tracking some of the wild wolves, and I really haven't looked back.
You said your degree was in biological anthropology?
Right.
I have to ask what that is. That sounds fascinating.
So it's, study of humans, really, and evolution, and it had a lot of environmental science components to it. It was sort of the biology, ecology, and behavioral biology part of anthropology. But it's actually really helped me out a lot today to have studied people.
Yes.
Because, a lot of what we do, I think a lot of people get into our line of work because they want to work with animals or with plants or be outside in the dirt, but 90% of what we do is with people. So it's actually helped me quite a bit more than I think I meant to.
So what do you do as deputy coordinator for the Mexican wolf recovery?
We work to oversee the reintroduction program in the United States. There's also a reintroduction program in Mexico that we work with, and we have a captive breeding program that supports both of those reintroduction projects. So it's a lot, you know. Day to day it varies widely. You know, some days you're dealing with animal issues, some days you're dealing with people issues, some days you're just dealing with paperwork. You know.
Sounds like my job.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how did the Mexican wolf become endangered?
People. You know, I think a lot of what we do kind of always comes back to people. So as settlers moved west in the 1800s, they brought with them their livestock, and livestock outcompeted the native ungulate herds. And so wolves and bears and lions, all predators turned to livestock as a food source, and we didn't like that, right? So there was a government-led anti-predator campaign to try to get rid of predators on the landscape, and unfortunately for wolves, it was really successful. So the last Mexican wolf was killed in the United States around 1970.
So where did the Mexican wolves you're working with today come from?
Basically out of Mexico. So they were, when the last Mexican wolf was killed in the United States, there were only estimated to be like fewer than 50 in Mexico at the time. And so a few years after the last wolf was killed in the US, the Endangered Species Act was born, and then a few years after that, the Mexican wolf was listed. And so we went down into Mexico through a collaborative effort with Mexico and trapped the last remaining wild Mexican wolves and brought them into captivity to start a breeding program. And that's ultimately what saved the species from extinction. Every Mexican wolf alive today can be traced back to only 7 founders.
Wow.
Yeah.
Has that caused problems with genetic bottlenecks and so on?
It has. So we haven't seen any severe genetic issues, nothing that's preventing recovery, nothing that's really slowing us down. But with only 7 founders, you know, you have to be really careful. We manage breeding in captivity to try to maintain, if we can, maybe even improve genetic diversity, but we are losing a little bit of gene diversity through time in the captive program. So recovery efforts in the wild are kind of a time crunch for us.
How do Mexican wolves differ from, say, gray wolves?
Well, they are a gray wolf. So the Mexican wolf is a subspecies of the gray wolf.
Okay.
It's just a smaller subspecies. They're only 55 to 90 pounds, so quite a bit smaller. And we don't have any black or white, you know, color variations. What you see with a Mexican wolf is really what you get. You know, it's the smallest, southernmost occurring and most genetically distinct subspecies of gray wolf, but you know, a gray wolf is a gray wolf is a gray wolf. Really, it's just smaller. Yeah.
And maybe geographically
Yeah, I mean,
disparate from...
Yeah, I mean, it's southernmost occurring and pretty southern occurring, right? All throughout Mexico and up into Arizona and New Mexico in the United States is its historical range. So when most people think of wolves, they think of big, snowy wolves in Canada, you know. So,
Right, timber wolves.
Right.
So up in Minnesota where I studied.
Exactly.
So how did Mexico not extirpate their wolves?
Oh, they were on their way.
Okay.
You know, we were gracious enough to give them all the trapping and poisoning techniques that we were using to get rid
Great.
of our wolves in the United States. And, you know, like I said, when the last Mexican wolf was killed in the United States, there were fewer than 50 remaining in Mexico. And by the time we went down to try to catch the last wild wolves, there were, you know, only a handful left. So they were well on their way to causing, they weren't on the way to causing extinction, but we were well on our way to losing the Mexican wolf entirely. Really it was sort of a last minute effort to grab a few, and that's what saved the subspecies.
So the gray wolf has a big old park called Yellowstone.
Yeah.
We were able to reintroduce them to. Where are you reintroducing Mexican wolves to?
Yeah, so in the Northern Rockies program, we often get compared to the Northern Rockies reintroduction effort, and they went into Canada and grabbed wild wolves and put them down into Yellowstone National Park and the Central Idaho Wilderness. And I'm grossly oversimplifying that. It was obviously much more difficult than that, but the two challenges that we have that are a huge basic difference from that is we don't have a large national park or central, you know, huge wilderness area. We are lucky enough to be working primarily on National Forest Service lands, so that's good. But we also didn't have wild wolves when we started. We had captive animals that had been generations in captivity, and it was a question whether or not they could even learn to hunt and have normal, natural wolf behavior, you know, dispersing from their pack, forming new packs and breeding. And but yeah, so we don't have a large core protected area, but we are lucky enough to be working on huge swaths of public land.
I think I like the National Forest connection because I think Aldo Leopold would be happy. He wrote a famous story about shooting the last wolf he saw, and probably was a Mexican wolf, I guess. That
Yeah,
was in Arizona.
the famous quote about the fierce
Fierce
green
green fire,
fire, that
yeah.
was a Mexican wolf, yeah.
Well, you're doing him justice
We're
by
trying.
bringing them back. Were there any problems when the captively bred wolves were released? Did they have any problem learning how to hunt or form packs or any of that?
So releasing captive wolves to the wild works, right? The Red Wolf Program has done it and established a population. We've done it and obviously have done pretty well establishing a population. It does have challenges, and those challenges do have merit. About 40% of our nuisance behavior that we document in the wild population comes from wolves that have been recently released into the wild. It was a necessity to release captive, naive wolves.
Right.
We tend to call them naive wolves. It was a necessity to release them to the wild to get the population going. But people's perception of wolves matters. People's experience with wolves matters. So it's not really our best foot forward to having to keep releasing these naive wolves to the wild. So we're lucky that our population is now growing on its own and doing really well on its own. And the only releases we need to continue doing today are to try to kind of boost the genetics of the wild population. And we've transitioned from releasing adult wolves that have that nuisance behavior to puppies. So we are fostering pups that are born in captivity. So these are more genetically diverse pups.
Yep.
And we're putting them, between 5 and 15 days old. We're moving them into wild dens, mixing them with the wild litter, and then we walk away and they're raised in the wild by experienced wolves. So it gets the new genetics into the population and completely eliminates the nuisance behavior that we might see with adult wolves.
So I got to ask, how do you introduce a wolf pup raised in captivity into a different wolf parent's litter? I mean,
Yeah,
do they notice?
They're only 5 to 15 days old. They weigh about as much as a
Yeah.
potato
Yeah.
so we go, it's not easy, right?
No, I
These
bet.
pups are, like this previous season, we fostered pups from a facility in New York, one in Chicago, one in St. Louis. So they're being flown all the way across the country, and then we drive them, 4 hours or whatever into the forest, and then we put them in a backpack and hike them up to the den. And we pull all the wild pups out of the den and we mix them all together, try to make them smell the same. They're the same age, right? Same
Yeah.
size. Try to make them smell the same, and then we put them back in the hole. And, I like to say, then we walk away and they're raised in the wild by experienced wolves. It's not
Hopefully.
quite that easy. As we do, try not to leave our scent there. We all wear descented clothing and things like that. But we're not really fooling the female wolf when she comes back. She knows there's been a den disturbance. Most of the time she does move the litter, and I think, or at least we think, what happens is their maternal instincts when their pups are that age are really, really high. And I think what happens is she comes back to the den and kind of panics a little bit that something's happened, and she scoops up all of her puppies, and moves them to a new spot and begins taking care of them, and I'm sure she recognizes that something's different, something's not right, but the maternal instincts, I think, are so high that she's caring for everything. Even the new pups that are in there.
That's fascinating. I had
Yeah.
no idea that was going on.
Yeah, we think we're tricking her, but probably not. Yeah.
As long as it works.
I think they're just good moms.
So you mentioned people have different perceptions about
Mm-hmm.
wolves and so on. Do you guys do communications or outreach to try to teach people in the areas where the wolves are being reintroduced?
Yeah,
more about
outreach
them?
is a big part of our program. I think every time we have an opportunity to interact with anyone, it's an opportunity for outreach. One of the tough things about wolves is they really bring out kind of this side of the fence or that side of the
Yep.
fence component in someone. And a lot of that's related to our value system, which, you're not going to educate someone into a new set of values. But an example that I like to give is, if you were walking through the forest and on a hiking trail or something, and a wolf came across the trail, stopped and looked at you and ran off, you might call our office and say, that was the most magical experience I've ever had, right?
Right.
And I might have the same exact experience where I'm walking down a trail and it stops and looks at me, and I might call the office and say, it wasn't afraid, I thought it was going to come hurt me. So that's what I mean by people's experience with wolves matter, and their perception of wolves matters. And, the wolf's behavior
Right.
also matters. So it's tough. You can't really out-educate or outreach, something that's really ingrained in people, but you can provide facts and information, and we find that that's really helpful in, people kind of tolerating our program. And when we first started doing releases of wolves, and they were mostly the captive kind of naive wolves, they were different animals that were on the landscape than are on the landscape today. So that's also really helpful. The animals today are, they've been living and making a living on a working landscape, and they've figured out how to avoid people and how to raise their pups in different areas and stuff. So
cool.
Yeah.
So my daughter's currently working outside of Yellowstone.
Okay.
And there's a huge industry in seeing wolves or hearing them howl and so on, and it's been a driver for ecotourism. Is that happening with the Mexican wolf too?
We don't have a large Yellowstone National Park with a
Right.
huge Lamar Valley where you can
Yeah.
sit miles and miles away with your scope and see, bears and wolves and stuff. We don't have a lot of ecotourism as far as like commercial stuff. There are certainly people who come into the area to try and see wolves, and they are spending money in the local, stores and restaurants and boosting the economy somewhat that way. But we unfortunately don't have, kind of the national park experience that you can get in other places. It's really thickly, densely forested, and our wolves are smaller and they're pretty elusive. And, wolves up in Yellowstone National Park, they're used to people not hurting them, which
Right.
is a problem when they do leave the park, right?
Yeah.
So we just don't have that situation in the Southwest.
The other thing every biologist knows from Yellowstone is they made the ecosystem healthier. Have there been those type of studies with the Mexican wolf?
Not to that same degree, right? We are trying to study the impact on the environment. The state game and fish agencies are trying to study the impacts on the elk herds and things like that. I think it's also important to recognize that we don't, again, it's not a national park where a lot of the environmental pressures in our region are from people,
Yep.
right? So there's hunting, there's grazing, there's all sorts of things that go on in a national forest, and so people are having a much bigger impact on things like the elk herd than the 240 wolves we have out there are.
Right.
There's something like 80,000 elk in our recovery area, so 240 wolves is not really doing much, to alter the behavior of those herds or anything. And wolves select different animals. When they hunt, they pick, the vulnerable prey, injured, old, young. And when people hunt, we're not picking vulnerable prey.
No.
We're picking the biggest elk or something. So different pressures on the environment. And we haven't seen a lot of changes. One, because our population is probably too small, and two, because the environment is so affected by other things besides wolves.
It's interesting they're eating elk, because you told me they're a smaller wolf and so on. Is that their primary prey?
We didn't study Mexican wolves very well before they were extirpated from the wild.
Yeah.
And when we wrote our first environmental impact statement, because of their body size, we assumed they would eat deer.
Yeah.
And so we released them in more deer-driven ecosystems, and they didn't do very well. And the ones that did well were the wolves that moved up into the more elk-driven environments or ecosystems. And so we started releasing animals up there, and they did great. And so about 80% of their diet is elk. So I don't know if it's a bang for your buck with the caloric load of an elk versus a deer, but yeah, our tiny little Mexican wolves do prefer elk.
Are there any other interesting facts we should know about Mexican wolves you want to share? Because that was totally new to me. I would have assumed they were eating deer.
Are there interesting facts about Mexican wolves?
Or anything
Yeah,
about
I don't
them
know.
you want to share with
I don't
people.
know. That's hard. That's a loaded question. I don't think so.
Okay. Why is it important we
don't ask me
reintroduce
that
Mexican wolves?
That's hard.
You've dedicated your career to it.
Yeah, I
Why?
have dedicated my career to that. At the most basic level, it is the responsibility of the Fish and Wildlife Service to try to recover endangered species. And there is an ecological niche for a large carnivore, right? A large predator. And, it's kind of one of those things that everything deserves a place on the landscape, right? And I think it was is it an Aldo Leopold quote about the cogs in the wheel,
Yep.
you know, and that's kind of true, right? I mean, we may not be seeing ecological shifts or changes from Mexican wolves, but, you know, they have to be there. Species have impacts on one another. You know, absent a large predator in the area, I think elk and deer herds do not move as much, you know, things like that. So I think, you know, as far as the environment goes, you know, every piece is important. So there is a role for Mexican wolves in the wild, but, you know, kind of at its most basic level, they deserve a shot for us to try to recover them.
You've worked with wolves, Mexican wolves, a long time. I'm curious about this because I don't work with wildlife. Do you end up feeling a special affinity for them after all those years?
When we were releasing a lot of adult wolves from captivity to the wild, my job back then included, you know, trying to pick which wolves were suitable for release. And even though the wolves didn't like me, you know, I spent days and days in an observation blind, kind of looking at and kind of picking and choosing which ones that we thought would do well. And, you know, to me, they all had personalities and they were all kind of little characters, you know, when we released them. And so, yeah, that was hard when, you know, you'd spend however long managing this animal in captivity and then releasing it to the wild, and maybe it didn't do well. But, you know, now that our population is growing and we're a little bit less involved with the day-to-day that way, you know, it's a little less kind of emotional that way. But it is really fun to see, especially with the fostering program. It's a great way for our zoological partners. You know, they have puppies that are born at their facility and then they're flown hundreds of miles and stuck in a den hole, and they get to watch them grow up in the wild, you know, as wild wolves. So, yeah, there's an emotional component to it for sure.
How many wolves are there in the wild now, Mexican wolves?
Our end of 2022 population count was at least 241.
And do you have a goal that you want to reach?
Our recovery criteria for the U.S. population is at least 320. So
you're getting close.
We're getting close, yeah.
That's great.
Getting close.
Where could people see wolves, say in a captive breeding facility or someplace where they're likely to see them?
Yeah, captive breeding facility is your best bet.
Yeah.
We have 60 captive breeding facilities across the United States and Mexico. That's your best bet. And then if you want to see one in the wild, you know, Arizona and New Mexico, Apache National Forest and Gila National Forest. But good luck. You know, unless you know where they are, they're kind of tough to find.
Thank you, Maggie. This was really informative.
Well, great.
And
Thank
I'm
you.
looking forward to your talk tonight, and we appreciate your time.
Thanks. I appreciate yours.